There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast, Twilight Zone Edition. I'm your host, Scott, and joining me for an in-depth chat about these two Twilight Zone episodes, it's Joe. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Scott. Hello, everybody.
Tonight's podcast, we will be diving into two more Twilight Zone episodes, I Shot an Arrow into the Air and The Hitchhiker, which are the 15th and 16th episodes from the first season of The Twilight Zone. So, let's start with I Shot an Arrow into the Air. Now, this episode was directed by Stuart Rosenberg. Rosenberg was a Brooklyn boy who got his break directing TV series throughout the mid-50s and 60s. He was on the precipice of getting his first shot to direct a feature film back in 1960. It's one that would have starred a young Peter Falk, in fact. But a combined strike of both the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild, sounds familiar, derailed that opportunity. Afterwards, still making his mark doing several episodes of things like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, as well as other series and made-for-TV movies, he got another shot when he signed a deal with Jack Lemmon's independent film company, JALM, I guess short for Jack Lemmon Productions, and the first film he developed and then directed was Cool Hand Luke. And that actually started a long-standing relationship with Paul Newman, because Rosenberg would go on to direct Newman in 3 more films, including The Drowning Pool. He also directed films such as The Laughing Policeman with Walter Matthau, and other major titles under his belt would include the original Amityville Horror and The Pope of Greenwich Village. He essentially retired from filmmaking and instead became a teacher at the American Film Institute. Among his students were fellow Brooklynite Doug Ellen, who would go on to create the HBO series Entourage, Todd Field, the eventual director of In the Bedroom and Little Children, and Tar, actually, and Darren Aronofsky, the man behind films such as Requiem for a Dream, The Wrestler, Black Swan, and The Whale. And as always, as we circle back to the Twilight Zone, he also would go on to direct 2 more episodes in the 4th season, He's Alive and Mute. Now, the episode, once again, was written by Mr. Serling, but it was actually based on a story by a writer by the name of Madeline Champion. Now, usually when I say it was based on a story by another writer, that means it was a published work, and I'll have made an effort to track it down to read, or at the very least try to seek a review and a breakdown of said story. But this is a more unique and rather odd situation. And to give proper credit, I am going to mostly quote from the website greatbooksguide.com while inserting a little additional line I found in IMDb. Turns out Rod Serling was at a party when he was approached by a woman named Madeline Champion, who gave him the idea for an episode. She had written the basic framework and plot twist of a space crew that crashes onto what appears to be a remote asteroid but is later revealed to be Earth. It is believed that she said, what would happen if 3 guys landed on what they thought was an asteroid and it turned out to be outside of Las Vegas? Serling was so infatuated with the idea that he paid Madeline $500 on the spot and gave her a writer's credit in the episode. This is the only instance of this happening in the Twilight Zone.
I was kind of fascinated by this little tidbit of information just because, having been a writer in Hollywood myself, it's pretty common for people at parties or whatever to say, hey, I got an idea for your show, or hey, I got an idea for this. And, it's always sort of an awkward meeting sometimes, because of the legalities of stories like that. But I thought this was interesting that I'm certainly not putting myself on the level of Rod Serling, but I can relate to that moment of being approached with an idea or a story. And I thought it was fascinating that he actually said, hey, that's good. Let me pay you for that. That happens a lot in Hollywood. The person that approaches you sometimes, very oftentimes, is not a professional writer or not someone, quote unquote, in the business. And that can be an awkward exchange. And I just thought it was kind of fascinating that, perhaps the greatest writer of them all took this idea from a party and compensated and credited the writer.
Let's move on to the cast, and I'll start with Edward Binns, who played Colonel Bob Donlin. Binns rode a bit of a career roller coaster in the 1950s, where he was seen in dozens of live TV performances, as that was quite common in the 50s, as well as films such as 12 Angry Men. But he was also mistakenly blacklisted for a few years because the House of Un-American Activities Committee thought he was related to a Brooklyn councilwoman. He also ended up getting his own TV series, a cop show called Brenner, in 1959. It's a series that lasted for 5 years. Good luck finding someone who's ever heard of it. He made dozens of TV appearances, from recurring roles in It Takes a Thief to a number of popular series such as The Fugitive, The Rockford Files, MASH, and Alice, and several more noteworthy film roles over the course of time in films such as North by Northwest, Judgment at Nuremberg, Failsafe, Patton, and The Verdict. And back to Twilight Zone, as I tried to do whenever possible, he does actually appear in one more Twilight Zone episode that also deals with astronauts, Season 5's The Long Morrow. Next, we have Dewey Martin, who is Corey in this episode. Martin started off with several small roles in feature films such as The Thing from Another World, The Big Sky, and The Desperate Hours. But along with The Twilight Zone, he mainly appeared in a number of TV series for the rest of his career, which he actually cut short. Didn't take another role after 1978, although he did live for another 40 years in relative mystery and obscurity. Ted Otis plays the third man in what remained of that crew, Pearson. Otis, another New York City native, had a very abbreviated career, appearing in a few westerns such as Maverick and the Rifleman, and a couple sci-fi-based anthology series such as The Twilight Zone and the lesser-hailed One Step Beyond. His last role was one of the doctors in the infamous film Hands of a Stranger. This is the one where a concert pianist loses his hands in a horrible accident, but surgeons attach new hands to him in an experimental operation, and the hands drive him mad. So let's get to the episode. And as always, we start with Mr. Sterling's opening narration. Her name is the Arrow One. She represents 4.5 years of planning, preparation, and training, and 1,000 years of science and mathematics and the projected dreams and hopes of not only a nation but a world. She is the first manned aircraft into space, and this is the countdown, the last 5 seconds before man shot an arrow into the sky. And from here, we see quite a bit of actual stock footage. We see the Arrow 1 blasting off into the sky and beyond, and we soon learn that the folks here at Mission Control have lost contact with the ship. We then find out that the ship has crash landed, and we see that 4 of the 8 men survived the crash, although 1 is critically wounded. They assume they're on an asteroid mirroring the orbit of the Earth due to the placement of the sun in the sky, and that's when we get to size up the 3 conscious and unscathed men. You have Colonel Donlin, a by-the-book and intensely practical leader of the crew, Flight Officer Pearson, who seems to be an affable and loyal crew member, and Flight Officer Corey, who certainly does not. Emotions and tensions run high almost instantly as Corey objects to giving water to the wounded man, clashing with Donlin and Pearson. Eventually, the 4th man does die, and later Corey and Pearson set out to see if there's anything on this asteroid other than rocks and hills and sand. Corey eventually returns, and Donlin instantly and correctly suspects Corey killed Pearson and took his remaining water. Holding him at gunpoint, by the way, it's interesting to note that astronauts that were originally targeting landing on an asteroid would have guns with them. I understand they're military men more than space adventurers, but let me get back to the story. They take a trek to find Pearson, and after several miles trudging through crevasses and passes and such, they find him. He's still alive, but barely. He tries to say something, attempts to draw a symbol in the ground, in the sand, but he expires. Unfortunately for Donlin, who was excitedly curious about just what it was Pearson saw when he reached the high ridge above them, Corey has managed to get his gun, and he shoots him, takes his water, and sets off on his own. And here we are treated to another example of mid-episode narration by Mr. Sterling, although I would say we're kind of well past the midpoint of the story. Now you make your tracks, Mr. Corey. You move out and up like some kind of ghostly billy club, tapping at your ankles and telling you that it was later than you think. You scramble up rock hills and feel hot sand underneath your feet, and every now and then take a look over your shoulder at a giant sun suspended in a dead and motionless sky, like an unblinking eye that probes at the back of your head in a prolonged accusation. Make tracks, Mr. Corey. Push up and push out. Because if you stop, maybe sanity will get you by the throat. Maybe realization will pry open your mind, and the horror you left down in the sand will seep in. Yeah, Mr. Corey. Yeah, you better keep moving. That's the order of the moment. Keep moving. And it's that narration which is really the soundtrack for Corey's journey scrambling up the mountainside and eventually making it to that ridge, where he falls into sobbing hysterics when he sees telephone poles and billboards and a bus and a sign indicating that Reno is just 97 miles away. And so we close with Mr. Sterling's thusly. Practical joke perpetrated by Mother Nature and a combination of improbable events. Practical joke wearing the trappings of nightmare, of terror, of desperation. Small human drama played out in a desert 97 miles from Reno, Nevada, USA, continent of North America, the Earth, and of course, the Twilight Zone. So, first things first, I will say right from the top, this is actually not one of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes, and that's by a fairly wide mark. Putting aside that if you know your poetry, you would recognize that that line, the title, isn't from some nursery rhyme. The title is actually taken from the opening lines of Henry Longfellow's poem, The Arrow and the Song, where it's, I shot an arrow into the air. It fell to earth. I know not where. Sterling even referenced the poem in his tease for this episode that followed the previous one. That went something like, he actually says, there's a Longfellow poem. I shot an arrow into the air. It fell to earth. I know not where. In our story next week, we shot a spaceship into the air, and where it fell, only you and I will know. I hate to break it to you, Mr. Sterling, but that poetry lines and what you just said, you kind of already told us where. On Earth. That's where. So for me, Joe, that's kind of issue number one. And which I didn't necessarily know when I was a kid, of course, because I don't know how many 8 or 9-year-olds are reading Longfellow. But also, and just with that, it just recycles the same twist that we already had gotten in Third from the Sun. You know, yet another episode where the reveal is actually in the title, and it's Earth. Because I know there's at least 1 or 2 more episodes, and one of them is very highly acclaimed at that also feature a very similar twist. But here it just bothers me because it's super predictable, and because Third from the Sun was so recent, it just doesn't feel that fresh or original to me.
I agree with you, and it's interesting because on one hand, I kind of like the themes of, oh, we were on Earth all along. However, I feel like in the Twilight Zone universe, that seems to happen a lot, and I don't have an actual count for that, but I just feel like it's a whole subset of episodes that we could probably count. And the fact that they were on and it was shot the same location as The Lonely, which we talked about, earlier in our podcast ventures, and that whole we're on a rock, it's in the desert. What world is this? Now, we should mention too that ironically, that's also somewhat related.
Are you going to mention a certain other movie that Sterling had a
yes, but I'm getting the visual connection. Maybe I shouldn't.
No, go ahead. I had that queued up, but go ahead.
Rod Serling, of course, he didn't write the original book, but he wrote the screenplay, co-wrote the screenplay for Planet of the Apes. And of course, spoiler alert, that's the big reveal at the end. Oh, we were on Earth all along. So, I don't know that I like to use the word cliche, but I do feel like this is a path well traveled in the Twilight Zone universe. And I like the concept, but I feel like it's used a bit much.
Right. I remember thinking that he does this again in screenplay for Planet of the Apes, which, if I'm not mistaken, if I am, I apologize, but I think he came up with that ending for it. That's not the ending in the original book. I don't think the reveal in the book is that they were on Earth all along.
I believe you are correct, but I don't know my Planet of the Apes trivia well enough to.
I'm gonna say I'm like 90% sure.
I'm sure one of our listeners will correct us if we're wrong.
There you go. So like I said, I kind of opened talking about the episode with my issues with the end, which isn't normally the way I go about this. And also, look, frankly, although we always have to suspend so much disbelief with any number of Twilight Zone episodes, mostly because, people really weren't aware of the true issues of space travel and things, because it's often the space related episodes that may give one pause. But here, I find it very hard to believe that these men wouldn't have figured out that they were on Earth. Explanations like, we must have crash landed on an asteroid, presumably not the one they were originally targeting, I guess, that's in the same orbit as the Earth based on where the sun is and how big it is. Right there, the strain of incredulity for me is being tested. Because if the sun looks the way it does on Earth, why does no one think, hey, maybe we crash back on Earth? I mean, I would like to give Sterling some leeway here, because I'm going to say, maybe he didn't realize that an asteroid cannot have an atmosphere, and any astronaut would know that. But for whatever reason, and it may just be the predictability factor, which I don't mind in a lot of other episodes, it just really bugs me here.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I feel like on past episodes of this, I've been sort of the guy who's poking hole on the willing suspension of disbelief, and I don't want to be that guy because I'm a big believer in willing suspension of disbelief. But I tried to tell myself with this one, okay, this is a couple years before manned space flight anyway, would become much more in the public eye, and we'll give them a little leeway for some of these things. But yeah, it works both ways. That with mission control, I'm thinking, wait a minute, they said they lost track, but presumably this thing just went up into the sky, maybe it broke the atmosphere, then arced back down to Earth, and you're telling me they can't track it from that distance? Or vice versa, if you really want to be silly about it, the astronauts on the craft themselves, couldn't they just look out the window portal and say, hey, we just it just doesn't make sense that, or this whole episode must have taken you know 10 minutes maybe of flight time. They wouldn't have made it to an asteroid. So just those little things kind of bugged me. I thought we should be a little bit better than this.
Yeah, they deliberately avoid certain things that would seem inexplicable otherwise. Because wait, did they all just black out and then all of a sudden that was it? At a certain
Even
point,
that explanation would have helped me. Just
right?
something that
But
a
but we
line
didn't.
like
But we
that.
didn't get that.
Yeah.
Now I can tell you when I did see this for the first time when I was a kid. What I do remember thinking was the minute I saw the crew, I said out loud, "They're on Earth. They just landed in a desert somewhere." So we're going to see like a truck or a phone booth or a billboard or something. So one thing, the fact I picked up on that as a kid kind of frustrates me. Okay, beyond my issues, which are almost inescapable as the episode goes on, I do like Binns as the Colonel in this, but he's also one of those very familiar character actors that was always solid whenever you saw him. So let's get back to being negative. Also, how much time passes? It never seems like it's been days. What has it been? A day or two? Does he say it in the diary at the beginning? I forgot to go check again. Because otherwise, I feel that Corey's descent into murder seems really fast. I mean, 5 gallons of water shouldn't last three guys for a
Oh, you are speaking my language, my friend. I thought he escalated. This escalated quickly was, the famous line that came to mind. I'm like, I just needed a beat of him to be normal before he automatically goes into,
yeah.
Murderous crew member.
He's pretty much like that from the get go, and it feels like they just got off the ship. It's hard for me to say much else beyond my issues with it. I mean, was the concept of gravity being different on places other than Earth not a thing then? But then I realized, actually, it never was in a lot of sci-fi that you see from the 50s and 60s. Even think about Star Trek. Whenever they were going to a planet, they would always be checking about the atmosphere and the radiation level. They're never checking about the gravity situation at any planet they go down to, or they send a landing party to. So that I would let go.
There's one other issue that I have with this, and I don't know that we have a tally of this yet, or that we will eventually, but it's not terribly. It's pretty rare when Serling narrates mid episode. I'm not a huge fan of that. But this one in particular, I did not like because he's speaking directly to the character essentially, and essentially judging him and like, hey, scolding him even a little bit. And I thought this is unnecessary, and I don't know what the purpose of this narration is, and it just comes at a weird time, and I would have much rather done without it.
I feel there are other Twilight Zone episodes where there's a moment where Sterling's narration seems to almost be directed at the character to a certain extent. However, that being said, I also didn't really care for it here, but I kind of knew why it was there. And I'm going to hold off on saying much more about that because it connects to something I want to say about the next episode when we're talking
Me
about
too.
that. I think they serve the same. I think they served a similar purpose. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
I will say this: if I had the idea for this episode, I would have saved it for a few years. I would have saved it for the hour-long episode season and played it out much further. I would have had Corey struggling to stay alive while trying to cover up what he did to Pearson and Donlin, and coming up with some twisty way for him to be caught as the murderer. And yes, I know that sounds more like a potential episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents than Twilight Zone. I just think it would have been that much more intriguing because, again, the big reveal, I don't feel kind of hits as hard as it should because it's like, I just think it would have been a more interesting story as a result if they did that. I'm ready to move on to the checklist, so that's what I'm going to do now.
Yeah, let's do that.
So, again, we know this is written by Serling and based on a story or really an idea by Madeline Champion. Tone of the episode, I would say it's rather serious, desperate, tragic even. Tropes. Oh, the tropes we have in this one. We've got astronauts and something goes wrong with the ship. We have the "it was Earth all along" twist, or something along those lines. Usually, just how many twists just have the word Earth in them at some point. We've got survival, we've got death, we've got murder, we've got a desolate environment. And now we have the ending. Now, I've already spent a great deal of conversation about this episode focused on the predictability of that ending and how in this instance it did bother me. I'm going to go under the midway grade for the first time since doing this podcast. I do think the worst grade I've given for an ending was the 16mm Shrine with a 5.5. This one bugs me so much more. I'm giving it a 4. And yes, the rhyme was deliberate. Now, for whatever reason, I do like the episode itself a bit more than that, but not much more. So therefore, it can share the same 5 that I gave the 16mm Shrine.
Well, what's interesting is, I mean, I know the rating, the ending is your area of expertise here, but I almost flip flop a little bit in the sense that I don't mind the ending, despite what I said earlier about it being a little bit of a cliche in the Twilight Zone universe. I liked less the getting to the ending because of the problems we've already talked about.
Gotcha.
I won't say I hated this episode. I just thought there's flaws and it could have been better.
Right. But with all that said, now borrowing the words that Rod Serling used to tease the next episode and refashioning them for the purposes of this podcast, we go with next on the podcast. You'll drive with Miss Inger Stevens, who starts out on what begins as a vacation and ends as a desperate flight. She begins her trip next on the Twilight Zone, and you'll be with her when she meets the Hitchhiker. We hope you'll be alongside. But instead of saying goodnight, I will instead start with the folks behind our next episode, The Hitchhiker. The episode was directed by Alvin Ganzer, whom we've actually talked about on this podcast that covered the first episode he had directed, What You Need. As I said then, he does go on to direct a couple more episodes in the first season, Nightmare as a Child and The Mighty Casey. Now, Rod Serling handles the writing chores once again, but this is his adaptation of a radio play by Lucille Fletcher. So let's talk a little bit about this most fascinating woman, Lucille Fletcher. Yet another person hailing from Brooklyn, New York. In fact, she went to Bay Ridge High School, which is now a high school by a different name, but it's only about 4 or 5 blocks from my house. Her oratory skills were off the charts, winning high school competitions, which led to winning national competitions, including one that was actually judged by 5 Supreme Court justices. After graduating from college, Vassar College, for those who are curious, she went to work at CBS. There, her jobs ranged from music librarian to copyright clerk, and it was there she met her first husband, the famed composer that we talked quite a bit about on our very first Twilight Zone podcast, Bernard Herrmann. She later wrote The Hitchhiker as a radio play and was written for the Orson Welles show. It was inspired by a car trip Fletcher herself experienced in 1940 while driving with her husband Bernard, when she saw an odd-looking man first on the side by the Brooklyn Bridge and then again later on the Pulaski Skyway. It should be noted that Bernard Herrmann— actually, you know what? The factoid I'm going to drop here, I'm going to let Joe say it because it's eerily familiar to a fact he dropped in our very first Twilight Zone. So it can be a recurring gag for Joe to bring this up.
Well, I won't bury the lead here. I feel like this whole thing is a little bit Citizen Kane adjacent, in the sense that Louise Fletcher, as you mentioned, was married to Bernard Herrmann, who, of course, famously did the music for Citizen Kane, as well as many, many, many others. And we won't go over that list in his amazing career as a composer. But the fact that they were friendly with Orson Welles at this point in time, and Louise Fletcher wrote this, and it was done by Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater, which, this vaunted group of radio theater actors that were first introduced to the world in Citizen Kane. I just found fascinating. And not only one time, but Orson Welles did this 4 times over the next few years. And what I mean, 4 times as a radio play on different shows that he was contracted to do. And so I find it very fascinating that how this particular episode, famous in its own sense in the Twilight Zone universe, had a life before this with the great Orson Welles.
Yeah, and actually I can quote Lucille Fletcher herself talking about that. In her own words, she said, "It was designed to provide a vehicle not only for his famous voice, but also the original techniques of sound which became associated with his radio presentations." As we know, and she says, Orson Welles and his group of Mercury players made this script a haunting study of the supernatural, which can still raise hackles along my own spine. Now, as for Serling adapting it, the truly major differences are changing the gender of the main character, as well as the location of where the story starts and ends. Otherwise, it's fairly close. It's also interesting to note, because we're talking about a great filmmaker like Orson Welles, I would say a just as, if not greater, filmmaker named Alfred Hitchcock first tried to purchase the rights to adapt the story for his series, but his bid was rejected. Back to Fletcher, her most famous work is actually probably Sorry, Wrong Number, which was adapted as stage plays, radio plays, TV adaptations, and the big screen with Barbara Stanwyck. All told, she wrote about 17 radio plays, 10 novels, stage plays of both The Hitchhiker and Sorry, Wrong Number, and she even wrote a libretto for a Wuthering Heights opera her then ex-husband Bernard Herrmann was working on. So after all that info on the woman behind the story, let's get to the cast, starting with the woman behind the wheel. That would be Inger Stevens, who started appearing in early TV series when she was 19. I believe she was around 24 to 25 years old when she filmed the Twilight Zone episode. She appeared in a number of other TV series, including Alfred Hitchcock Presents for 66, and 101 episodes of the likely, also not well-remembered, The Farmer's Daughter. She did appear in a string of feature films as well. Probably the most notable one for me would be the Clint Eastwood Western Hang 'em High. Now, her life was one marked by tragedy, scandalous behavior, mystery, and affairs with some of the most famous people in showbiz. I kid you not, she had affairs with the likes of Bing Crosby, Clint Eastwood, and Burt Reynolds, all of whom she met while appearing in movies with them. But the most surprising and fascinating thing about her personal life was the fact she had been secretly married to actor and producer Ike Jones from 1961 until her death in 1970. And it was after her passing that Jones came forward with the revelation. You see, Jones was an African American, and according to Stephen's brother, they had agreed to keep it secret out of fear of exposing an interracial relationship that would ruin her career. But it's her actual passing where the worst tragedy lies. Now, Stevens had actually tried to commit suicide when she was feeling acutely depressed on New Year's Day back in 1959 by taking sleeping pills and ammonia. Later in her career, she and 11 others, including her co-star Rod Steiger, nearly died due to carbon monoxide poisoning because something had gone wrong with the fumes filling the Hudson tubes while they were filming a scene in the movie Cry Terror. Steiger later said she tried to refuse medical attention, wanting to die. But she once again tried to take her life in 1970, an overdose of barbiturates. And that time she was successful, and she was only 35. Oh, she does actually appear in one more Twilight Zone episode, the second season's The Lateness of the Hour.
Well, we talked about, or you mentioned her marriage to an African American. Of course, at that time, that was mostly taboo around the country and problematic. What's interesting is, and I didn't know this until I was doing a little research for this, that she was also in a movie that I find a little fascinating, just a year prior to this Twilight Zone episode in 1959, called "The World, the Flesh, and the Devil," where she stars along with Harry Belafonte and another gentleman. And the concept is very unique, and I don't think this movie is well known by a lot of people. So my little, public service announcement for this episode is go seek this movie out. And it basically, it's a sci-fi premise where everybody dies except for these three people, and there is, a subtext of a romance between her and Harry Belafonte, and really a triangle between the other white gentleman. So it's sci-fi, but it's also sort of social commentary, which I think is a kind of a unique mix. And I just saw this movie for the first time about a year or two ago, and didn't even know it existed, and was kind of fascinated by it.
Okay, so now let's move on to the man standing by the edge of the road in this episode. We have Leonard Strong in the role of the Hitchhiker. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah, Strong appeared in many feature films as well as TV series over the course of 4 decades. He was often cast to play various Asian parts, be it Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and so on. He popped up in multiple episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, but he's probably best known for 3 other things. This episode of The Twilight Zone, a role in the classic film Shane, and appearing twice as the Claw, or as Maxwell Smart would say, the Craw, in the classic comedy series Get Smart. Since he gets significant screen time, let's give a nod to Adam Williams as the sailor on leave. Cinephiles, like the two of us, undoubtedly recognize him from North by Northwest. He also appeared in films like The Big Heat and the B-movie Without Warning, I love this, where he starred as a man so obsessed with his estranged wife, he would pick up women who bore a close resemblance to her and murder them with a pair of garden shears. Yep, that was a movie. And he does appear in another Twilight Zone episode, and it's a light and goofy favorite of mine that we'll get to eventually, called A Most Unusual Camera. Beyond that, we have actors making brief appearances who all appeared in multiple Twilight Zone episodes. We have Lou Gallo, the friendly mechanic. He shows up in 2 more Twilight Zone episodes. Season 2's The Rip Van Winkle Caper, and Season 4's On Thursday We Leave for Home. Russ Bender, the counterman at the diner, also shows up in 2 more Twilight Zone episodes. Season 3's The Fugitive, and he co-stars in that Thursday We Leave for Home episode. George Mitchell, who some might recognize as he's the rather cantankerous and rude gas station man, he shows up in 3 more Twilight Zone episodes. Later this season, the episode The Execution, Season 4's Jess Bell, and Season 5's Ring-a-Ding Girl. So there's your cast. And now, finally, Joe will get into the content of this classic Twilight Zone episode.
Well, as we said, this is episode 16, called The Hitchhiker, originally broadcast January 22nd, 1960. And we start with the opening narration. Her name is Nan Adams. She's 27 years old. Her occupation, buyer at a New York department store. At present, on vacation, driving cross-country to Los Angeles, California from Manhattan. There's a little bit of story that happens, and then the narration continues. Minor incident on Highway 11 in Pennsylvania, perhaps to be filed away under accidents you walk away from. But from this moment on, Nan Adams' companion on a trip to California will be terror. Her route, fear. Her destination, quite unknown. And then the plot is thus. Nan Adams, as we already indicated, is driving cross-country from New York to Los Angeles, and she survives a car accident in Pennsylvania. Soon after, she begins seeing a mysterious, shabby-looking hitchhiker who repeatedly appears along her journey, always ahead of her no matter how far she travels. No one else seems to see him, and Nan grows increasingly terrified, convinced he is following her with deadly intent. Now, desperate for protection, she picks up a sailor, and when she tries to run over the hitchhiker and the sailor sees nothing, he abandons her, unsettled by her behavior, thinking she's a little crazy. Alone and frightened, Nan eventually calls home, only to learn that her mother is hospitalized with shock because Nan herself had died in the accident days earlier. Realizing the truth, she understands that the hitchhiker is the embodiment of death, patiently awaiting her acceptance. And in that final moment, she sees him in her car mirror, gently asking, "I believe you're going my way," thus sealing her fate in classic Twilight Zone fashion. And then we close with the closing narration by Serling. Nan Adams, age 27. She was driving to California, to Los Angeles. She didn't make it. There was a detour through the Twilight Zone. Pretty good close on there by Serling.
First thing that struck me about this episode, Joe, and want to get your opinion on this, is the sheer amount of character voiceover throughout the episode. Because I don't recall how many times it's ever been done in the Twilight Zone. For me, it was just a real indicator that this was based on what was originally a radio play more than anything else.
Yeah, I really had a problem with the copious amounts of narration, in my opinion. And learning, now through our study here, that it was a radio play, I do see where maybe that comes from that. But nonetheless, this is a TV episode. There might have been one or two times that a voiceover might have worked or worked okay in moderation, but so much of it I thought was just way too much, and it seemed very written. It wasn't like dialogue that, someone would just have in their own mind when they're kind of going crazy or scared. It was very written, like a great author would, like Serling. So that took me out of it a little bit too. And most of the time, I thought the visuals worked. I mean, this could have been almost a silent film practically, other than her encounter with the sailor and the gas station. I mean, her visuals on her facial expressions told me all I really needed to know of where her character, the fear that she was experiencing. I didn't need the narration.
I absolutely agree with you. I understand why it happened beyond it being based on a radio play, and that was the best Henry can get on it, doing an adaptation. Also, at that point, if a similar story like this had been made for the first time in more recent years, and doesn't have to be, it could even be late last century, even, I think they would have been more comfortable having long stretches without dialogue. I think at that time for television, I think it just would have spooked people at the network, whatever, to just have it like that. I mean, think about people's reaction to like the stretches in Vertigo that don't have dialogue, but that's Alfred Hitchcock, and it's on a movie screen, and he had director's cut, so he can get away with that. But I don't think they would have been able to get away with that here. At least that's my only explanation for it, because otherwise, it's everything you said. It feels intrusive at times. It definitely look. Serling can be superfluous with his words sometimes, and quite often you can really hear Serling in his dialogue and how he writes for characters. This felt overwritten in many spots. I think you just said that as well, and that is. I hadn't watched this episode in a while, and that was like the first thing that struck me. It's like, ooh, I think I'd like this episode so much more if she spoke so much less.
Well, two things. One, as a writer yourself, writing 101 for television and films is show, don't tell. So, it's a visual meeting. Let's see what she's feeling. And I thought we did most of the time. And secondly, I agree with what you're saying, because my memory of this one, and we'll get to this, where this ranks later, but it's a pretty known classic. I mean, this is one I knew from being a kid. I have images in my head of the hitchhiker looking at her in the back window of the car, a very famous still promo from the thing. So I remember this, at least the concept of it, fairly well from being a kid. But like you, I hadn't seen it in quite a while. I didn't remember or didn't know to care when I was a kid about the narration, and it just beat me over the head. And it kind of, I don't want to say ruined, but I felt, hey, maybe isn't the classic I thought it was.
I was thinking about it after, watching it yet again. And it took me back to the very first episode of the series. Where is everybody? That one's a little eerie, but that's about it. Oh, by the way, they get away with that one. He's just talking to himself, but it's not done as voiceover. So it doesn't bother us the way it does here. But she's not talking out loud to us. I almost think if she was talking out loud to herself, maybe at certain points it wouldn't have bothered me as much. I don't know. But the thing with that, whereas everybody was a little eerie, that's about it. Then you had later in the season, Perchance to Dream. That's a bit more unsettling, even somewhat disturbing. But when I look at the first 16 episodes of the series, I would think that The Hitchhiker is easily the scariest one at this point. I mean, both this episode and probably Perchance to Dream were not episodes you should be watching late at night just before drifting off to sleep, because they could give a young lad nightmares, and that young lad was me.
Yeah, and like I said, the image of that hitchhiker looking into her car window has been seared in my brain for 40, 50 years, or whenever I originally saw it then. So I agree. One of the scarier episodes.
And how well cast, just from his look, the hitchhiker really is, because they don't overdo his look too much. I mean, he's not especially a scary looking person, but it almost makes him. But that the fact that he isn't that scary looking kind of makes him more scary looking, if that makes any sense. There's something maybe, and just the way he keeps reappearing over and over. That it's those parts of the episode I just love. I was like, oh, and then when she gets caught on the train tracks, it's amazing. I'm just like going,
Well, the interesting thing about the hitchhiker is he is a little bit of a blank slate. You can kind of, project onto him your fears or whatever. And, I don't want to, give credit to the vast universe of fans out there, but every time we do these, I always like to just sort of get a spot check of what some of the comments are and, the IMDb pages and things like that. And there was a few people that noted that, hey, you could either see him as a kindly, angel kind of person, beckoning her to come, or a super scary, oh my God, this is the angel of death. And, so it could really kind of go either way, depending on how you're projecting. I think that's a thumbs up in the episode. And, just I will mention when we're talking about Leonard Strong, who played the character, I thought it was kind of fascinating that he played so many Asian characters throughout his career. Now, I know that was common practice in the day for a white actor, a Caucasian, to play ethnic characters, but I kept looking at his background to see, was he, have Asian descent? I couldn't find that. He was born in Salt Lake City, I believe. So I just thought it was a weird quirk because I didn't particularly think he looked Asian in this role at all. And it was just a sort of an interesting career he had in that niche.
right. When I was going over the cast, I deliberately mentioned where he was from in his name, because there's no indicator there, especially when you go back that far, that he would have had any Asian blood in him. I think a lot of those roles, there is a slight application of some makeup to heighten some of his features, which they were able to then, have him appear to be whatever Asian descent they were going for, because that was what they did back then. Oh, we spent a little bit of time talking about in the previous episode about the common, reveal or whatever of, it's Earth, or is Earth all along, or where are they going to? It's Earth, whatever. Also, 4 of the first 16 Twilight Zone episodes have a main character who either doesn't know that they're already dead, or that they're supposed to die, or something along those lines. Maybe I should be considering that some form of a trope as well.
Probably. I mean, it's definitely a recurring theme from time to time. I kind of already hinted at this, but um, my memory of this episode, I think, was better and or greater than my rewatching it this time. Which is not to say it was bad or I didn't enjoy it, other than, I didn't like the narration, as we've already established. Um, but it just it fell a notch or two in my memory, um, based on where I had it ranked in my mind for 40 years.
I'm ready to move on to my little checklist here. So, you know, I seem to be giving the writing credits at the beginning of the episode, every episode we cover. So why am I doing that here? So I'm not going to repeat that anymore. Let's just get to the tone of the episode. Well, you could say it's suspense, thriller. You could even say it's straight up horror. So it's dark, it's creepy, it's all those things. Let's get to those tropes. It's my favorite thing. Because, Serling, they love their mechanics and their gas stations and attendants and diners on the Twilight Zone, don't they? Then we have a car being the focal point of the episode, which you'll see happen quite often on the Twilight Zone. And as you had mentioned, well, look at that. We have another personification, of death, don't we? Now the ending. Okay. It's a creepy twist that you kind of see coming. And I know I was waiting for him to appear in that rear view mirror the first time I ever saw this episode. But I'm going to say here, unlike the previous episode, I think it works really well. I'm actually going to give the ending for this episode an 8.5.
Oh.
And that is also what I'm rating the episode. I'm giving the episode an 8.5. So going along with, what I think our sentiments are, if you were both doing them, as it might be different. My feeling is similar to what you were saying. I'm not necessarily placing this in the pantheon of the greatest episodes, which the episodes I'm giving a 9 and above. But it's, as you would say, it's that one step below, one rung below, the hall of the very good as opposed to the hall of fame, the second tier. It's not Mount Rushmore, but it's in the gift shop, or something.
I like that.
But it's like I kept toying with it. I was like going, I do have issues with the narration because I think there's too much of it. I would have rather, I didn't mind it in certain parts. In other parts, I really kind of dreaded it.
Another common criticism for this episode that we didn't address here, and we talked a lot about willing suspension of disbelief in the previous episode, is the fact that she's interacting and talking to real people, and she's supposed to be dead. Yeah. Now, I got to be honest, that didn't really bump me that much. I took that for what it was, willing suspension of disbelief. But I know a lot of viewers or fans of the show think that's a problem. Wasn't for me, but just wanted to address it.
The reason it doesn't bother me, it's based on how are you interpreting how they choose what her situation, that she hasn't left this earth yet. Is it that she's essentially a ghost? Because think about it. I'm going to go a little crazy. If she's a ghost, I don't know about that car either, because she was in a car accident. And the car was supposed to have been totaled. That's why she died. It was wrapped around a tree or something. So that car should not be in that condition. So if we're going to go crazier. So it's she and her car are a ghost.
Well, good point. I hadn't even thought about that.
But because it's still earthbound for whatever reason, it's not some sort of apparition. It still has solidity for whatever reason. Hence why the sailor can sit in the car or whatever. Mm-hmm. There's another thing you noticed, because I think in the story she is somewhere in Pennsylvania or something. And we see, because they mentioned Pennsylvania in the very beginning, I think. And we see it be day and night, whatever. Hey, we don't see her ever going to sleep.
I did think about that.
You don't see her stopping in a motel or pulling a Janet Leigh in Psycho and sleeping on the side of the road or something like that.
Which, by the way, the narration reminded me a little bit of Janet Leigh talking to herself in the car, but of course that's done in just a very small segment, so it didn't really bother me.
Oh yeah, and it works so well there. But yeah, I had the very same thought. But the reason why I'd still give a really high grade of 8.5 is, at the end of the day, it still works as far as being scary. There are those moments which the frustration of it, and you can kind of feel her desperation. I especially love when she realized maybe she should start coming on to the sailor, because the way he was kind of...
That was an interesting little twist. Yeah,
which I thought was a nice little reversal, because earlier in that same scene, when he's first in the car with her, it's very clear he's kind of eyeing her up and down, and he's got, an inkling of what he might want to do. And you can see her looking a little uncomfortable about it. And then once he realizes she might be bonkers, then she says, no, I really like you.
Another thing I want to just sort of say before we wrap up, the last line that the hitchhiker has, "I believe you're going my way." I love that line. That's one of my, favorite lines. And honestly, somewhere in my brain, I think I conflate that with the actual title of the episode sometimes. It's an indelible, going my way. Of course, that's a, Bing Crosby movie, but I think of that line when I think of the hitchhiker, and the things that it's inspired over the years and other, film and television entities.
Yep. For some reason, it reminds me of a line that we'll hear repeated in a Twilight Zone episode in a later season, which is possibly the episode that might be the one that scares me more than any other Twilight Zone episode, if I'm thinking about it. And that's the line where a person says, "Room for one more, honey." And I think says it a couple of times in that episode. And with that, it is time to dim the lights on this Twilight Zone podcast. Joe, I once again appreciate you making time to talk Twilight Zone. As always, thank you so much.
Thank you. And anybody who wants to learn a little bit more about what I'm doing can go to joefortunato.net, where I also share these episodes as well as some of the other things I do about classic movies and other stuff. So joefortunato.net, check it out. And Scott, thank you for having me on. I always love doing this and look forward to doing more of them.
I look forward to it as well. As for you, the listeners, the next Twilight Zone podcast, which would be in about 2 weeks' time or so, Jamie Jo Kelly is slated to make her first solo appearance here to talk about the next 2 Twilight Zone episodes from season 1. And there too, I'm actually looking forward to quite a bit. We will be taking a gamble with the 17th episode, The Fever, before taking off with the 18th episode, The Last Flight. I hope you all will join us then. Thank you, and good night.